Hello, I'm Louis Meyers, and welcome to this month's Meet the Author program. We're going to be in a series in which we talk about books and the authors who wrote them, and I'm honored today to have Mr. Bill Schubart in the studio with us. Mr. Schubart has a long history in Vermont, in the business world, in the healthcare world, in the communications world, and in the political world. But he's also, among other hats that he wears, he's a novelist, and he has written a brilliant and powerful novel called Lila and Theron. This actually came out in 2017, but in rereading it recently, I recognized that this is a timeless book and perhaps one of the most powerful short novels I've ever read. So I'm very honored to have Mr. Schubart here with us today to talk about this book, Lila and Theron. And for those of you who haven't read it, I'm going to ask him to give a brief synopsis.
Well, thank you. First of all, it's a pleasure to be here with you, and I appreciate the opportunity. And I don't always say this, but Lila and Theron, the book is based on the farm family who were our neighbors growing up in Morrisville. I grew up in Morrisville from 1947 on. I have to admit, I was born in New York City, but my father died before I was born in the war. And after I was born, my mother moved to Vermont because it's the only place she ever remembered being happy. She'd gone to the old Putney School, and she got off the Montrealer in Waterbury and took the Couture Jitney to Morrisville and rented a two-story apartment with me, and 2 years later married a handsome French-Canadian ski instructor named Émile René Couture. So I grew up with the name Billy Couture. And Dad wanted to build a house but didn't have enough money. And so he signed on as a carpenter with a local contractor who ended up building the house that I grew up in. And our neighbors, our closest neighbors, were Volney and Gladys Farr. And the book is based on them and my knowledge of them. And Mr. Farr actually gave me my first job.
What was that job?
He paid me $1 a week, and my job was every morning before I went to school was to go up to his barn, and he had 28 cows, every one of which had a name, and I learned all their names, and I would go around to the stanchions and open them, and the cows would follow me out summer and winter to his pasture behind our house. I'd open the gate and let them all out and close the gate, and then I'd go and walk to school. And then after school, I would come up and go out, and the girls, as we call them, were all lined up by the gate and ready to come in because they wanted to be milked. And I would lead them in, and they all knew which stanchion was theirs. Every once in a while, one would get a little confused and maybe go to the wrong stanchion, so I'd get them straightened out and make sure their water bowls weren't frozen. And then I would shut them in the stanchion. Then I would go in and report to Mrs. Farr, Gladys Farr, who Lila is based on. And I would say, the girls are all in, they're all in the right stanchions, and she'd give me a donut and a cup of coffee that was half coffee and half milk, because that's what kids drank when they were little. And I started doing that when I was 8. And then I would go home.
Well, there are echoes of that in the book, for sure. And it's fascinating to hear that these were essentially real people that you have fleshed out in terms of a novel. Now, the novel itself essentially begins in the very early 1900s. Mm-hmm. So this is, some 40-some years before you met this couple.
Yep.
How did you go back and research what life was like in rural Vermont in the early 1900s?
Well, two things. One, I've always been fascinated with, early Vermont, so I've read a lot about it. But also, growing up in Morrisville, people told stories. And our lives were just so rich with storytelling. I mean, we'd go to Uncle Mendoza Couture's for Sunday dinner, and Sunday dinner would be 3 hours, and it would be 40 minutes eating, and the rest was storytelling. You remember Sister St. Alphonse? Yeah, I remember her. Oh, well, she came over from Maine. She was born to a couple who both died in the 1918 epidemic. So her uncle, who was a logger, took her up to Quebec as a newborn and left her at a convent. So that's all part of this. So all these stories.
Did you have an inkling when you were a young person that you might want to write a novel someday, or novels?
I always wanted to be a writer, and I did. When I was in college, I wrote a short story that was published in the Great Lakes Review, and that gave me such a lift that they liked the story, that I was always inspired to do it. But writing is, as I'm sure you know, intensely hard work. And it wasn't really until I retired from the business that I had been running for a number of years that I had the time to sit down and write. And that was in 2008 when I wrote my first book, The Lamoille Stories, which is still the best-selling book I've written. And that was the stories. Many of them.
And how is that different than writing a novel, writing short stories versus writing a novel?
It isn't really. I mean, the difficulty is in a short story, it's finite. You don't have to worry too much about character development or the arc of the narrative, because you're telling a story, and you're taking oral tradition and putting it in print, which is challenging, but it's finite. Whereas in a novel, there's more of a continuum, and the arc of the narrative becomes very important. And I think one of the things, I end up talking to a lot of would-be writers and young writers, and one of the things I encourage them to do, which always throws them, is when you're comfortable with your manuscript, take it to 3 critical readers and ask them to read it. And it's a lot to ask. So you may even want to buy them lunch or, pay them something.
Did you have an actual formal editor?
Pardon?
Did you have an actual formal editor for this book?
Much more than that. The first thing I do is it goes out to 3 critical readers. Yeah. And I ask them for 1 page of feedback. And what I look for is consistency. And these are not family members or people, these are people I trust who will tell me the truth. Then when I find consistency, I go back and rewrite it again. Then it goes to a literary editor. And for years I used a woman in New York. And then when she's done, it goes to a copy editor. And the copy editor is the person who goes through and says, "What, are you crazy? That shouldn't be a semicolon, that should be a comma." And they make it, and people say, "Well, why do you bother with that? Who cares?" And the reality is, if you want to seduce somebody into following your story, then you don't want to put pitfalls in the way, like misspelled words, dropped words, bad punctuation, because the person then goes, "Oh, is that really how you spell that?" You don't want them doing that. You want them immersed. So that's why the grammatical piece, that's why copy editing to me is very important.
One of the remarkable things about this book is that it is a narrative, and yet it covers 80 years in this couple's life.
Yep.
and only 178 pages, I believe, and yet you feel the passage of time, which is a remarkable thing that you've been able to accomplish in such a short novel.
Well, I think what I really set out to do in Lila and Theron is to provide a continuum that explains where they came from, who they are, what matters to them, why they love each other, how they live together, and, right on up to the end of their lives. Yeah. It's a continuum. And we're all we imagine, I was born in 1945 and I died in, 2031. And it's not true. We're part of a continuum. We exist before we're born. We're being formulated before we're born. And then as we go forward, and then we have an impact on other people.
The nature itself, I think, is a character in this novel. Just the harshness of the climate. Perhaps winters were indeed colder back then. Talk about that a little bit, about how hard life was for people in those small communities.
Well, one of the things, we live in Heinsberg now, and people go, oh my gosh, it was 10 degrees, it's freezing. And one of the great gifts I give myself, we give ourselves, is my sister still lives in Morrisville, and my brother lives here, and we get together, just the three of us, no spouses, nobody else, and we just remember what it was like and how we saw it differently. And one of the things we were saying just last week when we got together was, every February in Morrisville, you could count absolutely on anywhere from 3 days to 10 days of 20 to 30 below zero. And we all remember as kids the snow up to the bottom of the windows. And it was harsh. And, we wanted to be inside when it was that cold.
Sure.
And I remember once a friend of mine had bought a large piece of land. I was a kid and he was 35 years older. And he paid me and a friend to tear down a wrecked house that was on 240 acres he'd bought up in Sterling, and which is no longer a town. And we tore it down, and in between the exterior and the interior, people had stuffed newspaper and deer hides to try and insulate themselves. Yeah. People lived very difficult, hard lives.
Harsh. One of the things that helped them is sense of community.
Yes.
And again, that's another important part of this book about what Vermont communities were like in those small towns. Perhaps they still are, but perhaps in a different way today. But they barely had telephones. They didn't have, obviously, internet or anything like that. So talk about what was community like in those days in the first part of the 1900s?
Well, it was very vibrant, and it's hard. Kate and I last fall drove up to Quebec, up through area where I knew all the towns, up through Johnson, up towards Newport, and up across Derby Line and into Quebec. And all these towns that I knew as a kid, all the facades were boarded up. There was a gas station convenience store that sold gas, nicotine, alcohol, vaping products, and junk food. And that was it. And as kids, Saturday morning, we would ride our bicycles down to Morrisville. There were 3 dry goods stores, there were 2 movie theaters, there were 2 grocery stores, there was an appliance store, a news store, 3 drugstores with soda fountains, and everybody was downtown. As my grandmother, who lived to be 102, used to say, trading, not shopping.
Yeah.
Everybody was trading.
The sense of support, though, there's a country doctor in your book, of course. There's there's a nurse who goes around and and a social worker of sorts who go around and look after people who are having difficulties. And yet there's a certain emotional distance. People were left alone to some extent to be independent as they could be or wish to be.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's very important to say, because I get asked both around this book and a couple of other books that I've written about Vermont and community in Vermont, is it just sounds so wonderful. And I go, no, wait a second. A huge part of the population were alcoholics, and they hid it. And as long as you hid it successfully, nobody talked about it. But if you're wandering around downtown, Saturday afternoon drunk, then you're an alcoholic. There was horrendous sexual abuse. Nobody talked about it because you didn't want to shame the family. So I don't want to paint a picture that it was magical and everything was wonderful and supportive. There was a dark side.
You talk, that is a big part of the book. The father of this young boy, Theron's father, is an alcoholic after he loses his wife in childbirth.
Yep.
And I don't know if I've ever read a better description of the sense of what it means to live with an alcoholic parent. There have been many books about that, but this book is terrific in talking about that.
Well, thank you. It's a real issue, and it's only, in the last, I don't know how many years, you would know better than I would, that we've come to understand trauma and the impact of trauma, because we just assumed it was part of life. If your father was an alcoholic, do the best you can, but nobody fully understood the impact on children of having an alcoholic, or both parents be alcoholics. Our neighbor, the other neighbor, both parents were alcoholics. And we're now beginning to understand, anyway, the impact of trauma and epigenetics, and but it was not understood at all back then. It was the culture was, buck up, young man.
There's one lovely character in this also, this little boy's uncle, Adrian.
Adrian, yeah.
Who comes in and essentially saves him.
Yeah.
Stepping in for his brother, Theron's father, who is an alcoholic, and then Adrian has to go off to war, World War I.
Right.
Comes back shattered, essentially. And again, in that little vivid portrait of this man, you see the effects of that war.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's. I had an uncle who, operated a flamethrower in, the Pacific Theater, and my own father died in the Pacific Theater, and he would wake up in the middle of the night screaming, and that character is based on his experience.
Yeah. So, tell me about this couple that you live next to. How similar were they to this wonderful Lila and Theron?
Very close. I did not need to invent them. Okay. They were there. Mrs. Farr, Gladys, once a week walked from their farm just up the hill down to our house, and she would bring fresh baked bread, homemade butter, and jams and condiments that she'd made, and she would sell them to us. And, a jar of strawberry, which she had picked, would be 35 cents, and a loaf of bread would be 55, and a thing of butter would be 65 cents. And then Mr. Farr had a kind of fallen apart truck, and he would drive around town and deliver milk in glass bottles, unpasteurized milk. And we bought his milk. So we knew them. We knew them very well. And I don't know, Volney didn't say a lot, although he had quite a sense of humor.
Yeah.
And to save money on gas, he mostly rode around on a bicycle.
I will say it's one of the sweetest, most touching love stories that I've ever encountered in a novel, which is, again, why I would recommend the book. Toward the end, you begin, I guess this is the 1950s maybe, you begin to see the change in the way farming is done as these small, isolated, independent farmers have to basically sell their farms in order to more mechanized, centralized farming. Obviously, that's a trend which has continued. Can you talk about that and how sort of the dairy industry today in Vermont, from your experience, where is it and where is it going?
It's interesting because you all have seen the numbers. I mean, there were 7,000 dairy farms, and I knew the kids that I went to school with were not, Morrisville had a very tiny amount of privilege. And our family, we were considered middle class, lower middle class, because Dad had a reasonable job. But my friends lived on hill farms, and that was really primitive. I mean, I remember literally hill farms in Elmore and Wolcott and Eden, the first time they were wired for electricity.
Yeah, it's remarkable. In this book, it's not until 1957.
Yeah. Oh, no. There were farms that had no electricity when I was a kid. And they would bring it in, and the utility didn't understand grounding. And so they'd install it, and there'd be a single ground. And what would happen was the cows, if they drank out of, these metal bowls, would get 110 volts, and they'd go crazy. Oh. And it was called stray voltage because it wasn't properly grounded. Yeah. And farmers who put in electricity just to have a light, this wasn't even about milking, because that was all by hand, just to have a light in the barn, took out the electricity because it drove their cows crazy. And I remember Mr. Farr, I remember him farming with horses. And one of my other jobs in the summer would be to stand on the back wagon with a pitchfork, and as the hay lift gathered up the hay, initially behind the horses, then later behind his Ford tractor, and it went up a slope and dropped it onto the cart, my job was to fork it to the back to make room for more. And we played in Mr. Farr's barn. We would climb into his silo. I mean, that's all in the story. And we'd jump into I remember once Stevie Greaves and I climbed up, and he told us to stay out of his silo. And we climbed up, and we went in, and it was about half full, and we jumped in, and it was the first year that he was mixing his chopped corn with molasses. Oh, gosh. So we were just totally covered with corn stuck to us. But, yeah, no.
Your version of tarred and feathered. Yeah. One of the things that I've noticed in my years here as working, my other job as a physician, when I talk to people in rural hospital where I work, and I will ask them occasionally, grown adults, did you do any sports when you were younger? And the answer almost invariably is no, because they were working on the farm. Yeah. And they did not have time for sports. So it was a completely different kind of childhood that many people in many of our communities today have.
Yeah. No, that's very true, Louis. I mean, I remember when I graduated from UVM, I was married. I was 23, married, had 2 children. I'd been going to UVM during the day, working the night shift at IBM. And I needed a job, and I got a job teaching French in Bristol at Mount Abraham the year it opened. And kids would come into my homeroom, and they'd be exhausted, you know, and they would smell of manure.
Yeah.
And they'd been up since 4:30,
Sure.
milking.
Yeah.
And this is 4 hours later, you know, and it was, you know.
Well, in the book, you know, we see that Theron does have the opportunity finally, thanks to his uncle primarily, and some teachers who were concerned about him, to finally get to at least go to high school, because he's a bright kid and has an interest in what he's learning. And so he does eventually spend his life farming, but at least he has that opportunity, and it's there that he meets his beloved Lila.
Yep.
So I want to recommend this book to all of anyone who can get their hands on it, and I assume that you have to order it these days on. How would people find this book?
Actually, a lot of Vermont bookstores carry my books. Not all, but you can walk into virtually any of the independent bookstores, and I always encourage people to buy books in bookstores.
Yes.
You know, I'm not against Amazon, but Amazon has
I didn't mention Amazon.
Pardon?
I didn't mention Amazon. Just
No,
want to
I
make
know,
it clear.
but you know, Flying Pig, Phoenix, most of them carry my books. So I would urge you to shop local.
Bill Schubart is one of the great storytellers in Vermont, and I just want to read this small blurb. Quote, "I got to read Lila and Theron in Vermont, of course. Wonderful. Tears in my eyes with the ending. Your artistry is superb. Signed, your old friend, Pat Leahy." So I think that that's pretty strong recommendation. And I want to thank you for being here.
What a pleasure.
And keep
Always
writing
good to
about
see you.
Vermont and all of the other activities that you do that help our communities so much. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much. It was good to
And
be here.
speaking of Senator Leahy, he will be our guest next month. He has written a wonderful political memoir called The Road Taken. So if you have a chance to read that this month, I encourage you. And we'll talk to him next month. And until then, be well.